2022 Presidential Address Ceremony. My name is Teresa da Silva Lopes, and I'm very honored and flattered to have been asked to introduce this year's BHC President Andrea Lluch. I've also been asked to show you two short videos recorded by our two mentors and most distinguished Latin American business historians, María Inés Barbero from the University of San Andrés in Argentina and Carlos Dávila from the University of Los Andes in Colombia. Unfortunately, they cannot be here physically in Mexico today, and I guess they will be online, but they kindly recorded a few words of introduction to Andrea's presidential address. Video, please.
Today, I am very pleased to introduce Andrea Lluch as President of the Business History Conference 2021-2022, and undoubtedly, all Latin American business historians will be delighted with her nomination. I have known Andrea for almost 25 years. We have written several papers together, and we have shared several academic activities. I have always admired not only her talent and her work ethics, but also her generosity and her constant willingness to cooperate with her colleagues, contributing to the diffusion of new information and new ideas. Andrea made her undergraduate studies and her PhD in history in Argentina, and she completed her training with a long stay at Harvard Business School as Fulbright Scholar, Newcomen Postdoctoral Fellow, and Research Fellow, actively participating from the beginning in the Creating Emerging Markets project coordinated by Jeffrey Jones. Today, she continues as Associate Researcher at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. Andrea is a key reference in the Argentine and Latin American business history through her research activity, her publications, and her institutional insertion. And she has been president of the Argentine Economic History Association from 2017 to 2021. In the research field, it is essential to mention her contribution to thematic and methodological renewal with her studies on foreign companies, business families, and corporate networks, among other topics, looking for a constant dialogue between history and theory. This occasion could also be a moment of reflection on the challenges Latin American business historians have to deal with. On the one hand, we need to integrate into the mainstream of the discipline through a permanent contact with colleagues from other countries. On the other hand, we need to recognize our specificities as part of the business history of emerging markets and to identify, disseminate, and integrate them into the main lines of research. Andrea is always giving answers to these challenges, in part through her constant participation at the Business History Conference meetings, building bridges among scholars from different geographical areas. Indeed, her current role of president of this business history meeting, embracing complexity and diversity, is a fair recognition of her trajectory.
María Inés Barbero from Argentina, I'm pleased to complement her words by addressing you from the University of Los Andes School of Management in Bogotá, Colombia. Since 2015, Andrea is Associate Professor in our school and member of the Business History Group. She is also a researcher at CONACYT, the Argentinian National Council of Science and Technology. Among other things, Andrea has significantly contributed to various projects to link Latin American business historians to the discipline's international academic community. I will point out to 6 undertakings. 1, carrying out first-rate research on entrepreneurial families, business groups, corporate networks, and globalization in the region, leading to a varied portfolio of publications, both in Spanish and English. 2, her active role in 2 Harvard Business School initiatives led by Professor Jeff Jones. 1 is the Teaching Business History in Latin American project started in 2008. A product of the book published last year, she co-edited with 2 other colleagues. It covered 6 countries. The other one, the Creating Emerging Markets Initiative, an unique resource for research and teaching, in which she has carried out over 50 interviews to business leaders in 6 Latin American countries. 3, participating in the initiative group for World Congress of Business History that over the last 8 years has organized 3 global congresses in Frankfurt, Berlin, and Nagoya. 5, promoting in several Latin American countries the importance of conservation of corporate and public archives and other sources. 6, I will also highlight the key role Andrea has played in demonstrating the potential of a close interaction between teaching and research. Having worked as a teacher with her in several courses, I have been much impressed by her teaching skills. To conclude, in coming from a region of the globe wherein male chauvinism is deeply ingrained, I am delighted to say that the future of the discipline in Latin America is to a good extent in the hands of women, and more to the point of a new generation of women scholars.
All right, before giving the floor to Andrea, I would just like to highlight some points made by María Inés Barbero and Carlos Dávila. Even though they said everything, I just like to highlight these points before giving the floor, as I said. Because I believe Andrea's presidency is unique in 3 main ways. Firstly, I should say that this year the BHC is making history, not just because the president is a woman, but because this is the first time the association has elected a president from Latin America. I have to say, I always feel very proud to be part of the BHC, which I genuinely believe to be the association which in different ways is ahead of the game in terms of its nomination of presidents. As Carlos Dávila rightly said, this is particularly remarkable as we still live in a world where men tend to get the top roles, top jobs, and top recognitions. The second point I would like to highlight is that this is the second time the BHC comes to Latin America. And both in 2019 in Colombia and now in Mexico, the choice of location and the success of these conferences relied to a great extent on Andrea's multiple endeavors and genuinely determination to put Latin America on the map of the world of business history. What is remarkable about Andrea is that she has not been making all these efforts for self-promotion or to showcase her own research, which, by the way, and as highlighted by María Inés and Carlos, is, as we know, is a key reference in Latin America business studies and in international business history as well, for the topics that she covers and for the very serious, in-depth, comparative and international archival-based research that she carries out. But like her mentors, Carlos Dávila and María Inés Barbero, Andrea's efforts have been aimed at transforming the discipline of business history in Latin America. With that purpose in mind, she has been at the front of multiple initiatives, such as the creation of platforms to help provide exposure by the Latin American business history community to business history research from the rest of the world, by facilitating and the showcasing of research by Latin American business historians to the rest of the world, and by promoting the development of networks of collaboration between scholars from different Latin American countries and also from other continents as well. Lastly, I would like to highlight that while we still live in a non-pandemic free world, as we know, where everybody's wearing masks, characterized by huge uncertainty and risk, Andrea's entrepreneurial and leadership skills are visible on multiple angles in the organization of this conference, of which I would like to highlight one point: a highly consultative spirit, which has led to the creation of a type of conference which met the preferences of all the membership, with an online event, with a face-to-face meeting, and with a hybrid component. Basically, what Andrea and her incredible team have achieved it was the organization not just of one conferences, but 3 conferences in one. I believe that Andrea will always be remembered as the BHC president who gracefully transformed the huge challenges and highly volatile and uncertain period when she was the president into great opportunities, making the Business History Conference the great success that we are witnessing. Before I give the word to Andrea, I would just like to say that in the spirit of the BHC tradition, there will be no questions at the end of the presidential address, and we will all move straight into the drinks reception here in Mexico, which we continue partying basically, and hopefully all of those of you online will be able to do the same. Without further ado, Andrea, I would like to now call you to the floor and for you to give your presidential address.
Thank you very much. Gracias, María Inés y Carlos. Los quiero mucho. Así que bueno, gracias. Before starting with this presidential address, I want to introduce sort of brief personal note. I'm not planning to talk about myself in my presidential address per se, so I want to use a few minutes to share with you some thoughts that are important for, I think, thinking together about this experience. The organization of this conference, as you can imagine, and we have been discussing, has been surrounded by uncertainty, the pandemic and its multiple side effects, and now in 2022, the war in Europe forces us to remember the worst tragedies of the 20th century. If this is not a challenging, uncertain setting, what is? Throughout this process, I've learned a lot in multiple ways. In the next few days, we are likely to take stocks, revealing lights and shadows, hopefully more lights than shadows. For the time being, I would like to focus on celebrating this reunion after over 2 years and take a few minutes to be thankful. This conference is the result of a great, huge collective effort. Much as I would want to, I cannot name everyone who collaborated to make it happen, but I hope to express my heartfelt and profound gratitude to you all, each and every one of you, those who are in Mexico, and I'm looking at you right now, those who are been able to come and are connecting by Zoom. I would like also to thank my colleagues in Latin America. As some of you have said, I think that being here today is another collective accomplishment. To me, this is a milestone in a much longer process that will undoubtedly continue to include more voices in the BHC community, in this case from Latin America. In this regard, I appreciate it, acknowledge, and celebrate BHC for being an organization characterized by this membership generosity and welcoming spirit, as we have been discussing earlier today, its quest for more inclusion and plurality, and its unwavering wager on future generation. So I think this is something for celebrate. Those who know me are aware of my somewhat reserved and very self-critical nature. Almost undermining this very description of myself, I say this because it will shed some light on the thoughts that I'm going to share with you, which surfaced during a process of self-reflection, nearly a deconstruction of myself as I looked for meaning in a challenging, at times disheartening environment. do I view myself as a researcher? What can my point of view add to this rather complex Latin American South? The pandemic kept me secluded in Argentina for 18 months. And almost as a disclaimer, I would like to note that one key interest of my reflections will focus on recovering debates created from and for the South, particularly Latin America. And now let's start with a very shortened version of my presidential address. The presidential address has a not very original title, as you can see, but I want to add to this more complex issue, sort of Latin American view. Let me say that the boundaries of business history as a discipline are constantly revisited. There have been contradictory views on the nature of our field for many decades, and they continue to exist today, reformulated by new generation and interest groups. And if these differences were not enough, there are also substantial disparities on when and how the subject has evolved worldwide. Furthermore, business historians have explored new theoretical and methodological avenues in the past 2 decades. Highlighting the current growing richness and intellectual diversity of the field does not preclude the recognition that mainstream business history for much of its existence has been characterized by the Western-centered approach, which also has assumed masculine norms. I'm not denying the fact that the discipline has expanded to new geographies in the past decades. I simply suggest, as a departure point, that the business history of the rest of the world was largely neglected for many decades, and when it made the headlines, it was primarily on dedicated or special issues. An ongoing research project led by Beatriz Rodriguez and Julio Zuluaga has revealed that 125 articles on Latin America business history were published in 4 business history journals from 1950 to 2021, last year. This accounts for barely 42% of the total, clearly pointing to its marginality. The available data yields several other, albeit contrasting, findings. It confirms that business history has expanded even more in scope in the past 15 years to include different world regions, bringing a whole new set of empirical settings. Yet, when it comes to Latin America, a look at first authors' institutional affiliation reveals that most of those articles have been written by scholars based in the United States and the United Kingdom, and with Mexico showing up only in 3rd place. So, while several signals point to a more multicultural business history setting, which is definitely something to acknowledge, some critical aspects, I think, remain unaddressed. How can we rediscuss and overcome the perpetuation of some hierarchies in our field? What are possible key insights for embracing an even more inclusive and pluralistic vision of business history? My proposition is that these issues can be rediscussed as part of a broader epistemological debate on humanistic and social science. Though some epistemological debates are confronted or even have changed the face of some branches of historical research, I propose business historians have a bit lagged behind. Let me move to this. Is working? Next, yes. First, let me begin to my arguments by asking about which categories are we using to organize business histories around the world. Yes, I know, dividing the globe into meaningful units as a framework to narrate the world's past is as old as historiography itself. However, tracing the origin of these partition and segmentations that continue to shape today's academic research proves relevant when thinking about potential futures for business history. The critical observation that aiding data on distant, geographically or otherwise, setting is not a tantamount to expanding the geographic boundaries of our field has been clearly expressed in an essay written by Gareth Austin, Carlos Dávila, and Jeffrey Jones. These authors propose that the business history of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, despite recognizing the significant differences among countries and within region in every country, can contribute something more radical and intellectually more challenging for the business history agenda. I agree that with linear approaches to capitalist development, not every market experience fits into existing frameworks, and many can be considered anomalous, exotic, and so on. However, labeling matters too. In particular, the issue or the question of which criteria prevail to define and name the heterogeneous space we study. It is valuable, then, to debate the categories we use to classify business histories worldwide, and more importantly, how they can be used analytically. The uses of meta-categories, such as emerging market and the more fashionable nowadays global south, are not new at all. There has been a tendency to frame all kinds of research on empirical phenomena within vast sets of areas, otherwise or simultaneously refer to, for example, developing world, non-Western economies, the periphery, or third world, the now outdated notion produced by the practices and discourses of development after the Second World War. Interesting for this conversation, even considering the variety of meanings attached to those of these terms, is the fact that almost all of them highlight one set of hierarchies, sometimes perpetuating them instead of offering solutions to overcome them. I wonder also if the need to name them as emerging or non-Western, or to use defined political and geographical categories such as African or Latin, suggests that they are novel and intelligible only through the discourse of the center? Or can they be known on their own terms? These are our challenges. Of course, you may be thinking right now, these partitions sometimes are simply a necessity or a mental routine that requires each other to exist. But the question underlying such required historical and spatial specificity is, can we entirely rid ourselves of Eurocentric bias or European American perspective just by incorporating the knowledge of others? As we know, many scholars have reflected on the late phase of area studies in the center, mainly the United States and Europe, and how, among other issues, they were isolated in separate enclaves and viewed as experts on the exotic other, and when coming to Latin America, on backwardness or chronic capitalism. I will further elaborate on the open meanings of Latin America as a category. But for now, what I want to underscore is something else. Turning to multiple versions of business history could be problematic if it's assumed that it solves the problem of Eurocentrism or Western centrism per se. So, what other kind of frameworks could we imagine? A critical step that is not totally original, I must say, but can have a significant impact is asking, and sometimes I'm doing myself this question, so Latin Americanists or other people, is asking about understanding the distinctive features of the business culture in a given place. Describe a historian who freed themselves of some of their preconception about the normal path to development or about normal entrepreneurial and managerial behavior, to use here an assertion that was expressed by Rory Miller 25 years ago. But also, as a result of this call to critically use space classification as analytical tools, a question emerges. Is there a Latin American distinctiveness business history to be written? Let me say briefly that Latin America has thought about and seen itself based on its articulation with a more extensive world, always. Consequently, there has been a permanent tension in Latin American self-reflection, and this observation goes well beyond economic or business histories. Another example that comes to my mind to illustrate this argument is taken from the arts, and you have the picture over there. In 1935, La Escuela del Sur, the School of the South, and its creator, Uruguayan painter Joaquín Torres Garcia, published a manifesto accompanied by the first version of his seminal inverted map drawing, both reversing geographic cartography and repositioning a single and autonomous Latin America by itself as the top of the map Torres Garcia state, "Our north is the south. Nuestro norte es el sur." A passionate message veiled in a socio-political statement to invert the traditional artistic hierarchy, which at the time was dominated by European art. Thus, Torres Garcia formulated a sort of counter-history of art, rejecting the teleology ingrained and explored through historiographies, universalizing the West's own local artistic works. You may be asking, how is this connected with possible means to do Latin America business history today? To answer this question, let me now try to condense three ongoing parallel debates. The first one is Latin America as an idea. This is another of my favorite painters. The first debate revolves around the meaning of Latin America as a concept. Over the past decades, the usefulness of the term Latin America itself has been strongly questioned, especially in Spanish and more especially in Portuguese. In English, the idea of Latin America has not been criticized much, aside from the very much historicizing the old and new imperial connotation of the term and the Cold War origins of Latin American studies in the United States. We know, I think, that Latin America is a modern concept. The term itself didn't show up in spoken vernacular Spanish and Portuguese until recently. Also, Latin America refers to history, language, and culture. It constitutes a lasting confirmation of racial beliefs. Thus, as a modern highbrow conjecture about culture and indeed about race, the term Latin America fails to designate a rapidly changing reality. In a nutshell, several authors have remarked that the term carries the heavy load of excluding African American and indigenous population and should be used cautiously today. Hence, Latin America is a politically, morally, and culturally troublesome, but nonetheless remains a recognizable, albeit challenging term. So what should we do with it in historical analysis? Well, the reality is that as Latin America's best historians, we have not addressed much in this debate. While recognizing the shortcomings and limitation of the term, I would say that we have used it strategically and have embraced its very vagueness, and we have left it to each scholar to clarify and explain any specificities or the terms of its existence. This in turn implies paying close attention to local traits and rejecting unsustainable broad generalization while indicating the region's many similarities in terms of political, economic, and social structures. As we note in the introduction of the book Historia Empresarial de América Latina, which I co-edited with Marcelo Bukeli and Martín Monsalve Zanatti, we might talk about Latin America's business history, yes, but not in the sense of a notion that simplifies disparities and differences. Rather, each study should present cases or research problems that are bound together by the specific features of the region's business system, while at the same time underscoring the differences that characterize each country or a region, and regions in plural inside a country. Interestingly, this sort of strategic and vague use of the term Latin America can be seen as another point of convergence and can offer then a fruitful path. As Mauricio Tenorio Trillo considers, there is a growing tendency to use the term Latin America as a malleable vessel, and this is a quote, ready to be filled with interesting, important, more than national histories, and not only Latin American ones. However, other voices have proposed that training and placing truly more than national historians in Latin America, and I must alert you that this is a self-critic present in all historiographical balances about Latin America, has proved to be a challenging conundrum. And this is the second debate I want to discuss briefly with you now. Yes. The second debate, or the second discussion, can be articulated with a straightforward question. Is there any room in the field of global history for Latin America? As we all know, the global history field has been thriving for over 2 decades. However, unlike Europe, the United States, and Asia, which have witnessed a true boom in this area, there has been no such significant development in Latin America. Several global historians have been trying to explain why history, and I want to emphasize that, from a study in Latin America, not historian in the United States or Europe. Those who are living in Latin America have not English or have been disinclined to engage with global history. And one may ask this open question with global business history. According to Matthew Brown, and I agree with him, one of the causes of this distrust is the perception shared by many Latin American historians that global history has been hijacked by studies on some areas, which consequently impose their own historical and political agenda, thus creating frameworks of spatial segmentation, periodization, focal points that hinder the incorporation of Latin American history. One critical point is coloniality in this regard. Complementary explanations can be found in the denounced unilateral direction of knowledge flows. While most European scholars publish in, or at least read English, colleagues in the Anglo-American world rarely reciprocate. This asymmetry has caused resistance in several Latin American and also some European academic environments where scholars fear that their work is downgraded. And thus we come to an issue of the current Anglophone monolinguism in most academic disciplines. This is not only business history. This is an important issue, but, and recently we have a discussion in our in Congress, this is not it's important, but this is an essential point that I'm trying to make today. And my point is more close on the direction of knowledge flows. This question of knowledge flows raises an epistemological problem that touches the foundation of any historical and social science discipline. So a brief reflection on the third debate is necessary then to discuss the perpetuation of hierarchies in our field for a deeper understanding. This is the third debate, geopolitics of knowledge. The third debate is closely related to calls for decolonization of social and humanistic science. Without wishing to delve into a debate with multiple sides, I want to highlight how these voices have raised thought-provoking questions about the global or national politics of knowledge and the structures of knowledge production. Even in management and organizational studies, there have been recent demands to use critical theoretical frameworks for the construction of a more plural academic fields. Latin Americanists working on social science and cultural studies have been using the language of coloniality, decoloniality extensively to propose new ways of understanding Latin America's historical and contemporary relationship with the rest of the world. Historians, this is very interesting, thought have been more reluctant to do so. They dislike some of these statements for the crude astericism and for the oversimplifying arguments used to advocate, for example, that the social science commonly practices in universities around the world are only a product of the West. I agree with some of these critics. For example, it is one thing to reflect on the uses and abuses of Eurocentric concepts in social science and humanistic science, and quite another to uphold the historical formulation of supposedly pure and native models. However, instead of dismissing this debate entirely, it might prove useful, I think, to look into some of its insights. The geopolitics of knowledge is appealing. It's also part of this modernity, coloniality, decoloniality project fostered by Latin American scholars, and thus it is included among the so-called epistemologies from the South. In a sense, and despite the risk of oversimplification, these concepts ask by whom and when, why and where is its knowledge generated. A recent book called, and I think I have a slide here, but I'm not sure it's slide. The book called The World That Latin America Create, published by Margarita Fajardo, provides a good example. As the author states, through the story of Cepalinos, this is the chapter, referring here to the Economic Commission for Latin America School of Thought, and Independentistas, this book stands not only as a contribution to writing more inclusive or wider and deeper global history, but also as a challenge to narratives of the universal triumph of the global North economics ideas and institutions. Indeed, she ultimately argued that Cepalinos Since their projects emerged from the global south and expanded to the rest of the world, effectively inverted the traditional directionality of world making. From that perspective, Fajardo looks at the construction of a worldview of development from the intersection of Santiago de Chile, Rio de Janeiro, Mexico, and La Habana, rather than from Washington, London, or Moscow. Thus, the focus on the geopolitics of knowledge brings an opportunity to reflect on and gain a deeper understanding of the realities and diverse institutional, we are talking today about institution, and historiographical past in our field. How? This concept raises our awareness of the importance of situating knowledge production. At this point, it may be convenient to remember that in most countries of Latin America, business history has a marginalized position inside economic history or management studies, and that its historization remains low. There is no association that brings business historians together on a national or a regional scale, but also in an opposite direction, networking and collaborative projects, which is Ed Valle's presidential address topic, have played an important role and underlie many of the achievements and advancements in the production and dissemination of the discipline in the region, especially from the 90s to date. I also believe that is, at least for me, that is worthwhile to take this perspective to re-examine the interviews that Mario Cerruti conducted in 2017 with three field leaders, María Inés Barbero, you have seen her, Carlos Marichal, he was one of the keynote speakers yesterday, and Carlos Dávila, you also have seen him, or the self-reflection made some years before by Mario Cerruti himself or Rory Miller in 2015. In all five cases, five key persons in our field in Latin America, their views prove fascinating and shed some light on the development of the field in Latin America, especially considering their super heterogeneous trajectories, while illustrating the relevance of asking by whom, when, why, and where knowledge is generated. For example, María Inés Barbero, from a different, remembers the difficulties in accessing bibliographic resources even in the early 90s. She recalled that she was only able to photocopy the works of Alfred Chandler and other key mainstream authors when she traveled to Italy, as these materials were unavailable in Buenos Aires. Without falling into simplistic approaches, since I truly believe that academic networks, collaborating projects, and exchange programs have shortened in distances, I would like to invite you all to take a closer look at the site of enunciation and knowledge location when analyzing what has been written about a topic and how. This might help explain in a more emphatic way why business historians have not always been asking similar questions in different regions or even speaking the same theoretical languages. We can extend this analysis even further to mention very briefly the critical access to archives, a topic that have been discussed in the previous roundtable. This is not, of course, exclusive to Latin America, as these asymmetries are reproduced elsewhere. But as we know, the lack of written archival sources can be a constraint to the growth of business history due to the poor tradition of holding and opening, not only holding, opening corporate archives. Conversely, the scarcity of corporate archives has encouraged oral history projects that are trying to help fill this void. I proudly collaborate with the first version of the now called Creating Emerging Market project at Harvard Business School, and this set of interviews has grown into an archive of over 150 lengthy audio and video interviews with leaders or former leaders of businesses from more than 20 countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where the collection now features 63 interviews. But what is more important is these interviews show how oral history offers a nuanced understanding of business practice in Latin America. Of course, more needs to be done, but my point is oral history and other methodological strategies, and I think Stephanie Decker made this point earlier, it's really important to identify atypical primary materials are important tools to study underrepresented or marginalized groups, to challenge grand narratives, or as others have noted, to uncover the unconventional histories of capitalism. But let me ask, what separates convention from unconventionally? And now we're moving more to Latin America. The question is, well, based on the attention paid by scholarly knowledge, it's safe to say that entrepreneurs, individuals, entrepreneurial families, business groups, and business interest groups have been the conventional, not the unconventional entrepreneurship agent in Latin America, and therefore they have received plenty of attention, together with the heated debate on foreign investment and multinational, as well as the role of the state and state-owned companies. All these topics have garnered most of the academic attention. This agenda, as you can imagine, is much connected with the alternative business history proposal mentioned earlier, since it claims that these business responses arose in those areas because of unique challenge. In those areas of the world, apart from other characteristic, corporate strategies to deal with turbulence proved essential, say this author. But I would like to linger on this last point to reconnect with the discussion I mentioned before. What is my point? From the great rest of the world, and here I'm not referring to the concept of uncertainty that has received a great deal of attention, turbulence and stability have been more the norm than the exception. And here may lie strength for enriching not only current narratives, but contributing to contemporary present issues, for example, how business deal with inflation, or challenges in a new era of deglobalization of globalization backlash. For that, the question itself, I think, is not only to identify the commonalities, but the context-specific business responses to these more complex and stable contexts. Of course, you may be thinking that we, as historians, know that business decisions are not made in the void of perfect markets, but are subject to a context that result from previous events, and where each actor has an expected or desirable outcome in mind. But, I would say, in many scholarly discussion, many, not all, of course, discussion, instability is not the norm, as I said, but the exception. And several theoretical perspectives emphasize the benefits of stability. Plus, current business literature offers no consensus on why some business agents have endured longer than others in equally traveling environments. I think business historians are well equipped to provide richer explanation of those big questions, particularly in these times. For example, a sudden change in economic condition or a new political regime can undermine social capital and the rule of the law. But at the same time, periods of disruption can be opportunities for outsider or can breed the need for adjustment and fruitful reinventions. Going further, I think this is the fascinating most to me, such terms defined by the outcome, success, failure, not the process, hardly capture the moving and non-linear reality of developing a business in a volatile environment. Let me just provide an example, which is a bit sad for me. A noteworthy feature of Argentina was and is inflation. We have been discussing yesterday night during the reception. In 1966, as you can see, inflation rate, it reached 438%, achieved an all-time high in 1929 with hyperinflation at more than 3,000%. Then falling back to only 12% in 1922, and price levels stabilized during the second half of the 1990s. But by 2022, after the crisis, inflation was back up to 31% before halving by 27, and last year topped 50%, and who knows this year. That means that inflation has been the norm and not an exceptional circumstances or a specific disorder. As recently the Washington Post expressed worried about inflation, in Argentina, it's a way of life. Chronic high inflation affects the way Argentinians spend, save, think, and make business. And also explain that Mafalda, I have to show that for you, the most popular and famous Latin American comic strip in the world, is alive and retains its popularity for so long. He said, I don't love my inflation. And you? In this unstable setting, long-term planning often seemed futile and promoted the proliferation of opportunistic behaviors. Inflation management, I can give a class about that because I discussed with my students in Argentina and Latin American countries, and short-term policies characterize businessmen experiences. Here are some quotes provided by the Creating Emerging Market database, as I mentioned before, that illustrate my argument for the need for even more specific and context-specific question and, more important, explanations. One voice expresses, I started working in 1962, and for 30 years, until 1992, my entire experience revolved around a high inflation setting. He later added, I focus strictly on the short term, adjusting to short-term condition. I just thought, I just have to get through today. Tomorrow, we will see. Adapting to changing environments and learning how to play to your favor the redistributed game seems to have been a key factor for business survival in Argentina. Thomas Hudson, who led the Argentinian affiliate of the British chemical company ICI, remarked, but the notion of a strategy, a topic that Basic Historia Lab, but the notion of a strategy was put away, right? In the most critical time, it was just next month. Nonetheless, and in my full version, I will provide a lot of examples of research who have been dealing with these issues. Nonetheless, I think that business historians Latin American business historians have challenged the generalization dictum indicating that the interaction of firms with their environment ultimately determines a firm's fate. In fact, several scholars have also been have been highly conditioned not only by external or exceptional forces, but individual firms' backgrounds. For example, effective assembling and mobilization of financial resources, business families and leaders' own goals, and even reputational factors, given the owner-intensive nature of most of these enterprises and other regional trade. Meanwhile, other studies have identified other firms' responses, and I'm talking strategies, I'm talking about responses to face economic, institutional, and political turbulence. Business historians have stressed, for example, the relevance of non-market responses, internalization different functions to a greater reliance on interpersonal trust and networks, or the development and uses of contact capabilities. The importance of these practices, personal or corporative, has varied through time, for example, and depended also on the strength of the states and the degree of politicization of markets. In addition, existing cases such as not only plural behaviors, but also change over time, with examples of entrepreneurs or firms switching, following more categories here, from productive and innovative to rent-seeking behaviors. I think all of this topic is more than a hidden opportunity. And my point is that exploring these non-linear and even conflicting trajectories of the margins would enable us, I think, to reevaluate our shared assumption about the nature of business in more troubled contexts such as Latin America. But also, what we as business historians, all of us, ought to include in our scope of inquiry. I would like to now to re-engage again with previously mentioned debates and reassess what three former chairs of the Latin American Study Association refer to as an alternative form of Latin Americanism for the 21st century. They propose reviewing and decentralizing Latin American studies. For me, this is my reviewing Latin America would mean not only asking what Latin America means, which I have already discussed it, but also including more voices that could bring more meanings. With this premise in mind, I will now super briefly, and to ending this presentation, refer to some perspective that would enrich our research agenda, and in this way, our discipline. I realize that this glance has been even super shortly today, and is very likely to generate calls for further development or clarification or debate, but this is precisely the intention. First, I would like to say plurality is lacking. Identities are missing in our field. As mentioned before, Latin America came into wide use only recently. Meanwhile, indigenous peoples inhabited the Americas for thousands of years before European conquest. We need to explore the indigenous entrepreneurial ecosystem, not firms, ecosystems. Business history literature has ignored and remained silent about them. Business history has also largely neglected the African and East Asian diasporas, since most attention has been directed to European flows. And very recently, gender perspectives have been less present in Latin American business history literature, dominated by the more recognized roles played by male entrepreneurs, entrepreneurial families, and business groups. There are other neglected groups and less conspicuous business people who also deserve our attention, such as those who represent non-traditional businesses or alternative forms of capitalism, social enterprises, cooperatives, or like in Argentina after the crisis, empresas recuperadas, the worker-cooperated enterprises, hybrid social economy organization. Micro-enterprises, small and medium-sized enterprises are key players in Latin America, so much as they accounted for over 90% of all Latin America businesses and provide jobs for nearly 67% of the region's working population. However, and with very few exceptions, and some of them very recent, studies on small and medium enterprises from a historical perspective have proven infrequent and significantly fewer than those focused on large companies or multinational and state-owned companies. Furthermore, few scholars have adopted an alternative approach that requires shifting attention from formal business system to informal business practices. This is remarkable, since the informal economy in Latin America accounted for 34% of the average gross domestic product from 2010 to 2017, more than any other region in the world. A total of 140 million people work in jobs involving social vulnerability, limited rights, and precarious conditions. According to ILO, this number translates to roughly 50% of the overall employment in Latin America. I will stop here tonight, but I just want to add that I believe that the more intensive engagement with the more troubled countries can make even more relevant to our research the wide range of scholars interested in the institutional foundation of capitalism and its divergences in plural, ethics, organizational studies, and those who are interested in explaining why and how entrepreneurship differs between countries, regions, and time periods, and why and how these matter. Just for finishing, sort of ending words, let me briefly restate these main points. In any historiographical practice, it's not that easy to implicitly or explicitly overcome the various hurdles imposed by Eurocentrism or American perspectives. It then becomes a matter of finding ways to write with history. In my case, I'm advocating from a Latin American perspective that maintaining the due methodological rigor, historical depth, broad empirical and theoretical basis, while also, this is critical, reviewing and adjusting research questions, categories, and methods to the multiple asymmetric and changing historical situation. But let me say that Latin America, or any other place, ought not to determine per se our historiographical topics. The topic should define whether we speak of Latin America or not, and if so, how? Define the terms, why we're using Latin America and in which sense. This is what I have to try to emphasize today, proposing to reviewing and decentered analysis of Latin America. And in this process, it will be important to add, at least for the sake of discussion, epistemological analysis and concepts such as the geopolitical of knowledge that has originated in and from the margins. Basic historian, of course, will continue debating about the boundaries and identities of the field, and some insight from these calls to sensing the world as pluriversally constitute can contribute to enriching focal points that have been hiding the corporation in the mainstream of the other stories. I hope that this reflection could help enrich pre-existing conversation and have pointed to some insights to embrace an even more inclusive, global, and pluralistic vision of business history. The timing for embracing this conversation is good. Beyond any shadow of a doubt, there is a change in the air, and we are in Mexico City, which is not a minor point. And let me finish sharing. Jorge Luis Borges is one of my favorite writers, and he wrote more than 50 years ago in a statement that still is quoted with fury and passion, and that encapsulates part of what I wanted to share with you today. He said, "Debemos pensar que nuestro patrimonio es el universo. The universe is our birthright." Let me paraphrase the rest of this quote. We can take on all subjects, take them on without superstition and with an irreverence that can have and already has had fortunate consequences. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope some of us will have the chance to talk now, listen Son Jorocho, but before leaving, I want to ask Dan Wadhwani to come here to introduce our next BHC meeting in terms of, continue our discussion maybe one in the please, Dan.
Well, while Dan arrives, just some comments from the chat. Joanne Yates, congratulations on an inspiring presidential address, Andrea.
Thank you, Joanne.
Santiago M. Lopes, to everyone, congrats. Beatriz Rodríguez Atizabal, congratulations, felicitaciones, Andrea, muchas gracias.
Gracias, gracias a todos.
What a fantastic address to culminate a pretty amazing year. I've had a chance to get to know Andrea quite a bit over the last year. She's reached out in her famous collaborative style to bring me in on the leadership, and I've gotten a sense of the depth of her as a person, somebody with vision, but also somebody who is extremely kind of open and welcoming. So I can't imagine somebody who was a better leader in times like we've experienced over the last year. And I think that you can see that in the challenging conference of trying to organize several different kinds of conferences, the past and the present. So thank you very much for that. Very much in the BHC style, Andrea, Sharon coming up, and I have been kind of talking thematically about where do we go next. And I wanted to say a few words about that because I think it fits both with Andrea's message here today and with the kind of the sense of the conferences, both familiar and new, all of these new things. And we kind of, in collaboration, came up with a theme of reinvention for the next year. And reinvention in a sense that's distinct from invention, that's just about the new, but also about how the old is recreated. And in that sense, the way in which reinvention is key to the historical process itself. And of course, we in business history are familiar with reinvention at the firm level, but looking ahead to Detroit, we can also think about the way in which places are reinvented, people are reinvented, societies are reinvented, and communities are reinvented, including the process by which we as a community are reinventing ourselves right now, using and struggling with some of our old traditions and how they mean something different today, methodologically, how we communicate in so many ways. So the invitation is to bring forth all the historical creativity we have, unleash that. There's this sense of, after years of pandemic, that has been pent up, and to kind of, as a community, unleash those creative energies to rethink some of the challenges that Andrea mentioned. So looking forward to collaborating over the course of